Hello and welcome to our new video series about Battlesector 40k. Here we're going to show you how to get good at multiplayer. The kind of meta settings that people are playing now are strategic command, 8 turn limit, 80-point score limit at 2000 points. So what are the considerations before we even start playing the game on turn 1? And the number one consideration is, what is the map? And you have to think, is it a big map or a small map, or is it an open map or a closed map, right? What is your faction going to be? This is determined by who's hosting, because you have to lock your faction in when you're hosting. What is your opponent faction? And now, what does this matchup look like on this map, right? And what other considerations that there are? And to know that, you're going to have to know a little bit about kind of the strengths and weaknesses of the respective armies and how they play on various maps and what the matchups are like. We'll do deep dives into those in future videos, but we'll do kind of very high level summaries here. And then the last and really important thing is, are you player 1 or player 2? Because they're very different play styles. And I think only once you've considered all of these points should you then create an army. And I see many people actually doing this in reverse. They want to look through kind of unit reviews, they want to pick what units they want, and then they just play whatever match. You know, it doesn't matter what the matchup is, doesn't matter what the map is. They just want to play the army that they've created. And I think if you want to play this game at a competitive level in multiplayer, this is exactly the wrong approach. You have to look at what your army is, what their army is, what the map is, and if you're player 1 or player 2, to tweak your army list, because there are things that you can do that will make your list certainly better. So definitely get out of the habit of having just some standard army you play all the time. Now, why does the map matter? And that is because some of the maps are very small and some of them are very large. So if we give an example, I think something like Hivetop, you can actually have action turn 1 because the rush distances towards each other's deployments is very short. On other maps like Sanctum Sacrosanct, or I think Field of Skulls or A Place of Challenge, they're very large maps, and you're actually only really going to kind of engage each other on turn 3 rather than turn 2. But turn 2 is about normal on the majority of the maps. On the larger maps, mobility is worth a lot more because you're now taking 3 turns of movement. Being able to move an additional tile compounds 3 times instead of twice. Along with that, your ability to kite is greatly improved because now you've got much more distance that you can kind of move back before you run into like a wall or something like that. And the other thing is to consider whether it's an open map or a closed map. If it's a closed map, it's going to have lots of line of sight blocking terrain. It may even have kind of hard lanes that you're forced into, where if your unit can't hover or it can't fly, it can be very difficult to walk around these terrain blocking things. So on these kind of maps, having fly, hover, that kind of ability will help you massively. And then you've got to think, who does the map favor? So if you're on a very large open map, you know, for example, and you're facing Necrons or Tau, it's going to be a much harder game because they're just going to have massive lines of sight to you. You know, there might be like 15 tiles in a row where there's nothing blocking line of sight. All they need is range. And this is going to impact what you think your opponent list is going to include, and you should calculate this into what to expect from the opponent's side when creating your list. So going back to factions, what is your faction? What's your opponent faction? Every faction has different strengths and weaknesses. Every faction has kind of different preferences for maps, right? So if we do like an example, Blood Angels typically has access to a lot of jump infantry. You know, they've got their lieutenant who's got a jump pack. They've got land speeders which can hover, have a really good distance. They've got assault marines which can jump. They've got Death Company which can jump. They've got Sanguinary Guard which can jump. They've got Terminators which can teleport, right? So Blood Angels as an army, for example, really enjoys, you know, hard line of sight blockers, hard lanes that ground units would take, you know, 3 or 4 turns to walk around the corners of, right? Because you're able to suddenly leave a lane if you're losing it and create advantage in another lane with numerical superiority, right? And then every faction has some favored or disfavored or neutral matchups, right? So, for example, something like Tau into Blood Angels, for example, is a very favored matchup for Tau, and it's very disfavored for Blood Angels, right? So to do this, you kind of have to understand what your faction is good and bad at, and whether your faction likes or dislikes being player 1 or player 2. Now, whether you like being player 1 or player 2 is depending on whether you've got good durable units to hold points or not. So for example, if we look at Tau really likes being player 2 rather than player 1, and they don't like being player 1 because they don't really have units that want to sit there and get shot, right? But they do have lots of cheap units like drones that can clean the objective and score it, and then if they die, they die. It's fine with that. So let's do a very, very, very high level, faction level summary, right? So Blood Angels, they've got the most flexibility, they've got the deepest roster, and you can kit them out in very, very different ways. You know, you can go full armor, you can go full infantry, you can go full jump, you can go melee, you can do shooting, you can do all sorts of things, right? But in general, they've got a focus on short range shooting, with like flamers, or melee. The key thing to note is that their heavy hull blasters are very, very good at single target deletion that have high armor, right? Tyranids, they can go either way actually, because they can do horde, or they can do monster, and they've got a very flexible roster. So one of the hard things about facing Tyranids is you never know really what to expect in terms of your opponent army. So it can be very hard to plan for what that army is going to look like. Necrons, they're a shooting faction, right? They have some melee units, but they're a shooting faction. And what they generally want to do, all they really want to do is control distance. Now, they're very weak against evasion. Why? Because they have their base hit chance, which is okay. You know, it might be like 70, 80, 85%, but they have no real ways of boosting their aim. The only units that can really do that are death marks, and death marks tend to be quite inefficient against the majority of targets unless they're specifically single model units that have high evasion. Tau have great shooting, they've got invisible units, but they're significantly worse as player 1 versus player 2, and they've got very weak melee. Their lack of melee, you might not think it's important because they've got breaches that can do very short range shooting, but the issue comes to when you get tagged in engagement range, you get the the engagement debuff. You start taking 40% accuracy penalties to shooting. Whereas if you had real melee, you'd be able to break that with a rear attack. You have, I think, the only melee attacks you've got in Tau, I think, are the Ghost Keel and your Ethereal. And your Ethereal probably doesn't want to be anywhere near the action because getting them sniped is very bad. Sisters of Battle, very good close range shooting, very good melee. And they're very, very heavily dependent on getting their 2 CP for the +2 movement for 2 turns with their command points. They've got very high evasion with momentum, and this will factor into a lot of matchups where, against something like Necrons, for example, Necrons may just have a hard time doing damage to Sisters once they get high evasion. And you can have a lot of cases where you're leaving models with very low HP, but they've got 100% momentum, and now you're hitting them like 30-40%. And so you're just not finishing them off, and it can be very painful. Orcs are a shooting faction, not very orky, but that's just kind of how they are in competitive. And the thing that they have a weakness for is shooting into heavy armor. And the reason is they just don't have enough units that have good AP shooting. They typically are always going to have exactly 3 looters, because these are the units that can do good shooting into armor, even though I think it's AP 3, but it still does pretty good damage. But this is definitely a weakness of the Orc faction. So if you're facing Orcs, you should be thinking, can you overload them with an armor list? And they're just going to struggle with that. There's not much that they can do. And then with Khorne, they can do Horde armies, or they can do HQ summoning armies. They will be much, much, much stronger on large maps because they can summon on turn 3 without being under pressure, whereas on small maps, they're going to have to be into the action on turn 2, and if they wait to summon on turn 3, they tend to kind of lack the tempo to be able to do that. They may just get buried on points. And obviously Khorne have a melee focus, although their skull cannons are pretty effective. So how does this affect your army composition, right? And so we go back to what units are likely going to be in your opponent list, right? So if you're facing Tau, you're very likely to face stealth suits, because stealth suits are very good. They get to stealth, they get to shoot for 2 turns, and unless you detect them, you just can't target them back. So they get a lot of free damage onto you. Plus, when you detect them, they get another Overwatch. So how would you counter something like Tau stealth suits, right? And the answer is just really cheap units to eat the Overwatch and try and detect them, right? If you have something like Blood Angels, for example, you have no cheap units. Like your cheapest unit is an intercessor. That is how you would detect the Tau units, because you don't want to eat kind of fusion shots from the stealth suits on your land speeders or your sanguinary guard or your hell blasters or anything really. Intercessors are kind of your cheapest model that are going to eat that Overwatch, and even then that's still quite expensive. And then the thing to realize is, are you favored or disfavored in the matchup? And my personal logic is if you're around the similar skill level, if you're disfavored, you should actually try to high roll and lean into variance. So you should start doing weird and unexpected things that can get you sometimes a win, instead of taking your standard list, which always loses or almost always loses with a high percentage likelihood, but you might have a close game. But losing a close game isn't as good as sometimes winning, right? So I think if you're in a very disfavored matchup, you should start taking weird stuff and try and surprise your opponent. So why does it matter if you're player 1 or player 2? And this is, this goes back to kind of tabletop similarities here. So if you're player 1, you actually have to hold the strategic points through player 2's turn to score. So player 1 is heavily incentivized to take durable units to try and survive on the objective. But durable can mean different things to different people, right? So you can have just a very, very high raw HP pool, or you could have evasion, or you could have high armor, or some combination of all, right? So something like Gretchen from the Orcs, they've got very high raw HP. They've got 350 HP because they've got 10 units, 10 models that have 35 HP each. They've got, I think, 20 evasion. So unless you're shooting them with auto hits, something like grenades or flamers are really good. It's actually very, very hard to kill Gretchen. May not be hard in terms of actually killing them off, but they may end up eating 2, 3, maybe even 4 action points from your army to kill them off the point. Or you can go something like high armor, like a Tau commander with the ethereal buff. He's getting additional HP, he's getting additional evasion. He might have used his jump packs for additional evasion. That thing is like armor 9 or armor 10. It's very hard to kill off. Now, the alternative to being durable is actually to kind of, it's like a threat overload concept, right? And that is to have a lot of units near the point that are very high threat to the enemy. So let's have a look at two little, we'll do like a little picture here in terms of what we can do. So let's say we're the Orcs, and in this example, we've got 2 units of Gretchen, and we've got looters on the point. And this is not the preferred way of holding this objective, right? And presenting this to 3 units of Necron Immortals. Now, this is kind of like a toy example. We've simplified it. You're typically going to have more units on both sides, but I just want to illustrate a concept. And on the other example, we've got 2 units. We've got the same units, but now we've got Gretchen holding the point. And why is this strictly superior than the looters holding the point? And the reason is all 3 of these squads are 2 shots to Tesla Immortals from Necrons, right? You can't kill a Gretchen squad with 1 activation, you're going to have to shoot it twice. You can't kill a looter squad with 1 activation, you're going to have to shoot it twice. But on the left-hand example, the Necrons, they want to kill the looters anyway, because A, this is on the point, so they want to score it. Let's assume the Orcs are player 1. They want to kill the looters because they're on the point because they want to score it. And the looters are the high threat unit to kill. This is the target priority. So as a result, they get a 2 for 1 by shooting this unit. But in this example, if they shoot the looters, they won't clear the point, because this is going to eat 2 AP, and they'll shoot the ones on the point, but they won't kill it, and as a result, they can't take the point. Or, if they want to take the point, they have to spend 2 AP to kill the Gretchen, but then the looters survive, and they get and these are a high threat unit, and they can do a lot of damage. So you want to always park your trash onto the point if you're player 1 if you can, and leave your high threat units off the point to force kind of difficult decisions for your opponent. Now, beyond this in army construction, you want to think about what units can typically reach mid-board objectives on turn 2. And you need to have some of these. If you don't have any of these, on some maps, you're just going to start the game like 20 points buried. And 20 points deficit in turn 2 is quite hard to come back from. It's not impossible, but it's very hard to come back from. And with proper army construction, you just don't need to put yourself in that position. So what are the typical units that can reach the mid-board objectives turn 2, right? And so for Blood Angels, this is like land speeders, jump infantry, terminators. For Tyranids, it's gargoyles, trigons, or hive tyrants. You don't really probably want to be putting your hive tyrant on the mid-board turn 2 because it's too scary to do so, but you can reach it on some maps. For Necrons, it's like Scarabs, Praetorians, Tombblades. Scarabs very cheap, but they're likely to die. But they are going to eat at least 2 AP because they're going to reanimate. Praetorians likely going to use 3 AP plus to kill them because you're going to have like I don't know many things that are going to one-shot the first lives of the Praetorians, and they're going to reanimate. You have to clean them again. Tombblades quite squishy. You can reach them if you have to with the objectives, but they're quite squishy. Tau, jumpsuits, right? Because you can jump turn 1 then run, or you can run and then jump. The suits are quite durable, whether they're stealth suits, the commander, or crisis suits. But obviously they're quite a high value target. Drones can certainly reach it because they move 5 and they can advance with the action point. Piranhas also very good because they've got 6 movement, so they can move 7 with the action point. Sisters have a dedicated transport rhino, so you can put units into the rhino, then they can move the full amount, then they can disembark, and then the unit that can disembark can still move 2, even though the transport has already moved. So this is how you get additional movement out of the rhino, so that's how you could reach a point that's far away. Seraphim can jump and do it, but they're also very expensive. These are kind of one of your glass hammer units, so you don't typically want to throw them onto the point, although you can, especially if it's uncontested. Otherwise, Arco Flagellants are great because they've got base movement 5, they've got a lot of models, they've got a lot of HP, they've got some evasion. With Orcs, Warbikes, fantastic because you can use their abilities for additional evasion. They've got good movement. Deathcopters, good movement, but kind of expensive and a little bit squishy. Or Stormboys because they can jump. And they've got a lot of HP. But you probably want to use the Stormboys for something else, but you can certainly use them to score kind of uncontested points. And in Khorne, you've got a Bloodthirster because it's got high movement. It can fly if you want to use that. Or Blood Crushers because they've got movement 5, or Flesh Hounds because they've got movement 5. So you definitely want to have some of these units in your army so that you can score objectives turn 2. Now let's have a think about army composition and deployment. These are also factors that are started before turn 1 of the game, and I think among players of similar skill, this is probably the largest impact of the game, right? Versus, if you've got a skill mismatch, you can kind of do whatever you want with army comp and deployment, and you can probably still win. But among similarly skilled players, army comp and deployment has a very large impact on the game. So you need to determine a plan for your game once you know your opponent faction, the map, and if your player 1 or player 2. And typically what you're going to want to do is aim to hold 3 of the 5 objectives for the majority of the turns. Your plan may change as the game develops, that's fine. But going into the game in terms of deployment, in terms of army construction and the map, you should be having a plan in your head as to which of the 3 objectives you want to go for. You can hold more than 3, certainly. Or if you start winning the game very hard or losing the game very hard, it can change to like 4 or 5. But typically, it's like somebody holds 3, somebody holds 2 for most turns of the game. Now, we're going to do deep dives on specific maps of the future, because I think the video will be way too long if we did try to do all the maps now. But we'll keep it relatively general for this introductory video, but we'll cut away to a very quick summary of Imperial Palace to explain a little bit about what I'm talking about. Alright, here we're going to have a quick little look at the map Imperial Palace. We're not so much focusing on deployment, and you shouldn't look at the stuff down here as an ideal deployment. We're more going to look at how the map looks like, what are the characteristics of the maps, in terms of how we're going to pick which are the key strategic objectives on this map, right? So we'll see here, we have our home objective. Here we're going to want to jump something. We'll take a land speeder up here turn 1. And you'll see your opponent, they have a similar objective that they can take. And then there's a 3 in the middle. And on this map, the one in the middle is on this raised kind of platform in the middle. We've got one on the side over here. And we've got one all the way over here. And the thing to keep in mind is that this map has this raised platform in the middle, which kind of cuts the map almost in half, and then it stops over here. And this breaks line of sight. This is very significant in terms of how this map plays out. So you have to remember, because we're player 1, we get to move up first, and as a result, we should be running units up turn 1, and then turn 2 we can get up to here and we can overwatch. We can also tag the point, we can hide behind this little pillar, and then we can overwatch this point. Why is this point very important for player 1 to take? And why don't we take, for example, the side points, right? And the reason is that getting up onto the high ground first gives you very significant advantage, because they have to eat this overwatch. They may or may not have units that can absorb the overwatch efficiently, but they'll have to eat it before they're able to shoot. And as a result, because of the limited kind of way that they can come up, it's going to be very inefficient for them to do so. They're going to take quite a lot of damage, even if they move up, and they probably still won't have very good shots. And as a result, on turn 3, you can then move up to around here and do a very significant damage. So, in general, if people try to do a full frontal assault on the mid and you've set up a proper defense, they'll get punished very badly. So as a result, player 1 has very, very significant advantage on the middle point on this map. This point over here, this is very awkward to get to. Only a few units can actually reach at turn 2. But also, because of the elevation of where the point is and the way that these ramps are set up, it's actually also very difficult for slower units that can typically shoot onto the point or around the point to actually get shots off because of the elevation. So as a result, this point is actually very awkward. It's not so awkward for Blood Angels. We have so much jump infantry and fast units like land speeders, etc. But this is quite problematic for a lot of other armies. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that this point is very far away from everything else. Like it's going to take you probably like 3 turns even to get to the middle if you get this point. So what this means is if you control this point and you win whatever units you send there versus your opponent, you probably own this objective for the rest of the game. Okay, so this is something to keep in mind. Now, let's have a look at the side objective on our left here. This is also a very good objective to take. Why? Because we have our home objective here, and this is very close to our home objective, right? So if the opponent has this and we're weak here, they're actually very close to threatening our home objective, which is no good, because you generally don't want to lose your home objective as player 1. You can do so on certain maps where you kind of do like a full rotation with the opponent and you swap home objectives. But on this map, you typically don't want to lose this objective. You can do, but you typically don't want to. So why is it kind of better to be stronger on this side, on this map? The reason is, if we're strong here, we're actually very close to threatening their home objective and to support the middle. Okay, this is the thing to keep in mind. These 4 objectives here, they're all very close together. And this one is just very far away from everything else. So when you start playing the game and you start thinking about which are the 3 objectives that you want to control in the game, it's quite important to make sure you pick the right ones. There are specifically other maps that are very bad objectives to go heavy on or light on, depending on which player and which factions and matchups, etc. And we'll deal with those in future videos when we do deep dives. But this is the kind of concept that I want to get into your heads to start thinking about at this early stage. Okay, and then beyond that, we have to understand what your win condition is, right? So if you're player 1, you're typically going to have an army advantage in later turns, especially in close games. And why is this? And the reason is the game has a positive feedback loop, right? So you start with 2,000 points each, but because you're player 1, you go first, you typically get to do the first significant damage to the opponent, right? So, let's say we start at 2,000, we kill 300 points of their army, right? Now what happens is they are playing 1,700 points versus 2,000 points. It can do some damage to us, but not as much as we can, right? So as a result, they'll take us to, let's say, 1,800 points, right? And then in our turn, we'll take them to, let's say, 1,450, right? And as a result, because our army size will always be bigger, we'll start to gain our advantage in terms of army points remaining. Not all games have to go like this, but this is typically how they go. So as a result, if you start winning, you tend to continue to win harder. And the only feedback kind of the only catch-up mechanic in the game really are using your command points. Some factions have better command point abilities than others, but this is also why keeping your commander alive is very, very important. Now, player 2 can win games on points with the strategic points with almost no army left, but player 1 will struggle to do this because if you have no army left, it's very hard to hold points, right? It's way harder to hold points than it is to steal points. Because to steal points, all you have to do is clean the tile and then just throw something on it. And once you get, if there's no Overwatch, you can get past the Overwatch, you just score. So it's much easier. Your other kind of win condition might be if you've taken a skew list. Let's say you've taken a lot of armor and you get rid of all the efficient armor piercing in your opponent list. You may make a proportion of your army functionally immortal, which can make it very difficult for your opponent to kind of do any damage back, right? Yeah, so that could be a win condition in itself. Your unit doesn't even necessarily have to do a lot of damage, right? It could be a Turvagon, but you've killed all the armor piercing stuff. You've left them with 7 intercessors. Good luck with 7 intercessors trying to kill a Turvagon. It's going to take too long, right? And you just park that Turvagon on the point. Now, how do I think player 1 should act in the game? You get to move fast, so you're further up on the board, and you get what I call the first real turn of action, right? So you advance on the board, you set up Overwatch on strategic points if you want, or if the strategic points are a little bit further away, then maybe player 2 gets the first shots, but it's not going to be a lot, right? They're only going to get a very limited amount of units that can even get into range to shoot you, right? But as a result, that means turn 3 is the first real turn of the game where player 1, you get to do a lot of damage to player 2, right? And this is what we talk about the positive feedback loop, right? Once you start winning, you start winning more. So you get to inflict significant damage fast. Alternatively, if player 2 kind of plays more cagey, they hold more forces back. This typically means you're just holding more points, so you start getting point advantage. And a lot of the game is in deciding when to sacrifice army for strategic points, or when to not. Basically, that's a lot of what the game is. Right. A lot of the other game is in kind of tactics, execution. We'll certainly cover those in later videos as well, but that's going to come more with experience, and after a while it will just kind of become automatic, but we'll certainly cover those in terms of kind of tightening up people's gameplay on execution. Now, your focus as player 1 should really be to deal maximum damage to the opponent army, and in particular, that means identifying the biggest threats in the list, right? So you want to go after the units that do the most damage, that are most impactful, or you want to kill their mobility, that kind of a thing, right? Or you could play in a different way, which is if you're willing to sacrifice army to try and hold points, you might decide that your target priority isn't in killing the most killer units on the opponent army, but is actually in trying to clean all of their opponent units that are in range to score the objective next turn. Now, that may or may not be possible in early rounds because they might just have like 5 or 6 jump troops that can reach the point, and they've got 5 units that are in range of walking onto the point. So that may be difficult, but certainly in later turns, you can make that choice. Are you going to protect the point, or are you going to try and do army damage? And there are certainly many, many games where I think people just make very critical mistakes in terms of target priority. But we'll cover kind of that important aspect in later turns in future videos. Now, how should player 2 act in the game? I think you can choose to play slow and cagey, or you can choose to kind of commit to the point. And a lot of whether you're choosing to commit can be based on how much army player 1 has allocated to each strategic point. Now, the reason is player 1 is kind of forced to defend the points because they don't score unless they hold them. So what you're always kind of almost always left with is an option to shoot something that's on a point because they're always exposed, right? It's very hard to hide a unit onto the point. They're always kind of in the open, so they have to eat some shots. So you can dictate the pace of the game. You might decide, actually, they've put too expensive a unit onto the point. I can kill that for free. I don't have to further engage. That will mean that I won't score that point this turn, but you've dealt them significant army damage. And you might do this for 1 or 2, 3 turns is kind of a lot, but you can play slowly and chip away at their army and then decide, okay, in the later turns, I'm going to have a decisive army advantage, and then we're going to go for all the points thereafter. So you can certainly do that as player 2. Typically, though, what you're really going to be wanting to do is clean the objective, chuck a sacrificial unit onto the point, and then score it. You don't even have to stay on the point if you don't want to. But leaving it on the point is not bad, even though if you don't have to, because you force player one to then clean that tile from their perspective. It's an AP tax on them to do so, which means less shots going into your kind of important army units. The other thing which I don't have slides for is you should think about the 3 mid objectives as 3 blind auctions, because you don't know how the enemy's deployed, you don't know how they're going to move, etc. But you should think about it as 3 blind auctions. And what you're trying to do is win 2 out of the 3 auctions, right? If you lose 2 out of the 3, it's going to be a rough game, right? And what do we mean by winning the auctions, right? And it's because you have a certain limited number of army points, as does your opponent, and they're going to commit a certain number of troops to each objective, right? And what you don't want to do is lose them closely, right? What you want to do is win 2 of them comfortably and then lose 1 by a lot, right? So as an example, if your opponent let's say there are objectives 1, 2, and 3 from left to right, and let's say your opponent, as an extreme, they send all their army to objective 3 and you send half and half to objective 1 and 2. That means you win objective 1, it means you win objective 2, they win objective 3, right? You're winning 3 out of the 5 because there's 3 in the middle, each one has their home objective. But what does this also mean? They then have to take 1 or 2 turns to move from objective 3 to objective 2 because of distance. These are additional turns, you're holding all the points, right? So what you don't want to do is lose points by just a little bit, right? Because typically if the points are far away, you know, once you clean everything in that entire area, unless they've got fast troops that can kind of rotate around, you tend to own that point for the rest of the game. So what you want to do is avoid losing points closely, because that means you've committed a lot of points to that strategic objective, but you never score it, or you only score it for like 1 turn or something like that. So this is very bad. What you want to do is you want to be owning objectives and running away from fights you can't win. So, you know, you might have a plan and you see, oh my god, they've got their entire army on this objective. What you should do is you should just run away. And the faster you run away, the better it is. Typically, units in this game do not trade better than 100% efficiently. Some units can, but it's quite rare. Typically, you don't get 100% point efficiency in one activation. So as a result, you know, sending units to their death is typically very bad. You're always trying to get decisive engagements in this game, and the way that you do that is by creating localized superiority of force. Is a concept that I keep going back and, you know, over and over and over again to, because it's a concept that applies in real-time strategy games, turn-based games, like all of them. That this is always what the game is about. Do a ton of damage to them so there's nothing that can kill you back, or the clapback is very, very limited. So I think that's enough concept for now. Hopefully that video will help you guys get a little bit better at multiplayer, and we'll certainly do some deep dives into factions, into maps, into matchups, into kind of tactics, that kind of stuff later on. All right, thanks very much, and we'll see you guys next time. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and that's it. All right, thanks guys.